Good morning, Brooks. I wanted to start off by saying that there's not going to be any photograph of me as a kid. If there had been one, it would have been of me at the beach building a sandcastle, specifically a dribble castle, because apparently that was the only time that I would sit still long enough for a photograph. And regarding my hair, it would have been a long 70s mane of long, blonde, dirty hair. What I want to explore this morning is this theme of a dribble castle as one of the more powerful metaphors in how I see my life's journey up until this point. But I want to first give some chronology to that journey for context. It always starts with parents. Mine were part of a back to the land movement that brought our young family to Western Maine the year I was born in 1970 to a town called Strong, which has a population now of about 900. So back then it was probably about 880. From that time until I left for college, my entire life was spent on a farm, either that one in Maine or the one down in Northern Virginia where my mother moved back to in the late 1970s after their divorce. So with a strong connection to the land, I learned how to use my hands early on to build things and to do things. I accepted monotonous and often arduous tasks as the norm, weeding and mowing and bringing in firewood up in Maine. I learned that when animals aren't fed, they break down fences, and I learned that when they're not watered, they die. I learned that Mother Nature doesn't really care about excuses, however real, and I suppose all of these things go into what would be considered today as common sense. I think I had to grow up pretty fast. My parents' amicable divorce put me in a position to choose between homes. I moved every 2 years as a result. So by the time I graduated from high school, I think I had changed schools almost a dozen times. My first career could not have been further from that of a farmer. Evolving naturally from my choice of an economics major in college, my first career was a 12-year stint as an investment banking advisor to growth companies in the technology and healthcare industries. So for those of you who are thinking about your future, I would tell you if you're interested in business, there is no better way to get a rapid exposure to all things having to do with business. I don't know of any other better way. The work is fascinating and it feels very important when you're in the middle of it. You're rewarded for excelling in your college work and for being willing to work hard and smarter than the next guy, for strong communication and reasoning skills, and frankly, for all the things that your parents and teachers have been pushing you for doing for so many years. You meet hundreds of interesting people building great companies all over the world. It is a career, though, for young people who are able and ready and prepared to subordinate their personal lives for their clients. I started young, and I got out when I was still young enough to try something else. So when you get interviewed for these types of jobs, you need to be prepared for just about anything. There are two lines of questioning that stick with me today as the sort of glue that somehow binds together where I've been and where I'm hopefully going. One guy from Goldman Sachs told me that he too had grown up on a farm, and he wanted my thoughts on why kids who grow up on farms make good bankers. Another interviewer from another firm asked a very pointed and provocative question. She said, if money was not a consideration, what career would you pursue? So to the first question about farmers being good bankers, I totally fumbled through it. I didn't have a good answer. I didn't get that job. And to the second question about what I would do if money was no object, I had an immediate answer. I said I would be a boarding school teacher. I went to a large public high school, and other than some stereotypes from that movie, Dead Poets Society, I had no idea what being a boarding school teacher really was. It just sounded great. So after a dozen years, when the novelty of 5 a.m. flights, business suits, nice hotels, and boardroom presentations had begun to wear off, it was all too coincidental that we were living 10 miles from here, Brooks, where my wife had been a student in the 1980s. Our boys, Nate and Toby, were just a toddler and a newborn at the time. And when Kathy's former Brooks dorm parent and basketball coach, Bobby Crump, and her husband, Doug Burbank, came over for an afternoon, I was full of probing questions, mostly for Doug, who I learned at that time taught math and many other things. The long story short, about a year later, I began my career transition, a process that first brought me into contact with the then Dean of Faculty, John Packard, and then rowing coach Sally Morris, who agreed to hire me on as a JV girls rowing coach. So that initial experiment at Brooks evolved into a full-time position, as Arnaud said, at a school in Connecticut, where I served for the last 13 years as a teacher, a dorm parent, and a coach. But returning to my wife's alma mater at Brooks always seemed like a long-term hope of ours. So while Kathy and I, our boys, and our daughter Laura, who was born right after we got to this all-boys school in Connecticut, while we were all very deeply entrenched in our lives there, pretty much in all aspects of life, we decided to accept an offer at Brooks this past fall. So this is the second significant career transition I've been going through, and one might well expect that changing careers midstream from banking into teaching would be far more difficult than going from one boarding school to another. I can tell you that, in fact, I have found this much more difficult. And understanding and accepting why it has been so has been on my mind ever since. So I promised a metaphor, and here it comes. Last summer, I found myself with several weeks between schools, and I was trying not to get bored at a beach in Rhode Island. I was doing the one thing that I mentioned captures my attention. I was building dribble castles. If you haven't built a dribble castle, I'm not going to go through exactly what they are. Some of this might make less sense to you, but sometimes maybe somebody, you can ask how they're built and try it out, and then maybe you will remember what I'm saying. So back to this Rhode Island beach. I had chosen a spot where I could lift wet, soupy sand into the air and dribble it to form my castle, the sand and the water running down my thumb. Generally, what this means is that you're building your castle right on the edge of the ocean, so that the waves occasionally come in and they fill up your little pool of wet, soupy sand. And the sand was perfect, and there was little wind, and within half an hour I had this beautiful castle going with all these spires. And it really helped me because I was thinking about this transition that we were going through, and right then this enormous wave came up behind me, filled my bathing suit with sand, and took out the entire castle. And so as the water retreated back into the ocean, I'm sure I swore underneath my breath, all that was left was this wide pile of sand and a few little mounds of sand that had been my beautiful castle. And as I stooped down and tried to get the sand out of my shorts, and dropped down to my knees again and started rebuilding, a few feet further away from the ocean, granted, and I reached down to get that first handful of wet sand, and still thinking about our family's upcoming move and the tensions surrounding it, this dribble castle metaphor really became obvious to me. So all the things that we had built, the personal, the professional friendships, the physical surroundings, our comforts, our experiences in the classroom, the courts, on the water, they were all dissolved. They were all dissolved into memories and really accessible only through these sort of photographs or email exchanges with our former lives. And the same was true in my first transition from finance to banking, but the difference was this. I had moved to an entirely different beach when I did that. I didn't expect to reuse any of the sand from my first 12 years in my second career. But by contrast, we would be and are building at Brooks a castle out of the same exact sand that we used before, with similar ideas about castle design and techniques. And perhaps the greatest reason this has been so much harder for us is that it wasn't just my sandcastle and Kathy's sandcastle. It was Nate's sandcastle and Toby's sandcastle and Laura's sandcastle that they had built themselves over the last 13 years. And we told them where to build it. We said, build it right next to us. They had not chosen where to build their castle, and they did not choose to move it. We did. So I'm enjoying rebuilding this dribble castle that is my new life at Brooks. I realize now, after nearly a year, that my greatest personal satisfaction actually comes from the building process itself. I'm enjoying my piece of the Brooks mathematics curriculum. I'm experimenting with new modes of learning and understanding what works well in a co-ed environment. The Brooks rowing program has certainly provided a boundless supply of energized athletes and committed coaches and very supportive parents and alums and administrators with whom we've begun envisioning the Brooks crew of the next decade. So my hands have felt very sandy this year. And as I've gone through these inevitable ups and downs of this first year, it has been useful for me to contemplate this metaphor. It hasn't made the transition any easier. Frankly, just change is hard, whatever you make of it. But it has been easier for me to understand and put into this framework that reminds me of my favorite Rhode Island beach. And what is more, and perhaps more relevant to you, is that this analogy, this metaphor, has evolved since last summer. And it's sort of weaved its way into the way I think about my job as a teacher and how I think about my role as a parent and a husband, and perhaps even the bigger questions of life that start to come up when you're approaching your half-century mark. So if you'll bear with me, I'd like to share a few that may resonate with you now, or more likely may sit dormant until later in your lives. Send me an email if they do. So in my Dribble Castle guidebook, which is the 7th chapter of a book I'll never write, number 1, nobody ever starts a dribble castle with architectural drawings. They just grab a handful of wet sand and start dribbling. So likewise, I really don't think there's a blueprint to a successful or happy life or a meaningful life. There are only paths that you choose and paths that you don't choose. And remember, it is the dribbling, not the castle itself, that will you remember when you look back from this point, 30 or 40 years from now. So whatever you choose to do in life, my advice to you is do that which brings you satisfaction and joy while you're doing it. It sounds very cliche, but I think it's true. If you want to make a difference in human lives, if you want to care for people, pursue medicine. If you want to make things that do things, be an engineer. If you want to make tons of money because you think that that's going to make you happy, then do it. It seems to work for a lot of people. Number 2, a good castle has a wide, firm base. The wider the base and the larger the first scoops of hand, I think the higher you can build your castle. So start a few towers at the same time. And this notion may translate into waiting as long as you can in your educational life to specialize in a particular discipline or a vocation, or perhaps to attract you to more of a liberal arts tradition in college. Number 3, it is the water and not the sand that matters most in a dribble castle. There are, in fact, beaches, including one 20 miles away, known in the sand sculpting circuits for the perfect structure of their grains of sand. But with a dribble castle, it's the water that you scoop up. It is the water that carries each grain to its spot in your castle and leaves a moist residue that holds it fast. The water that flows down through the entire structure keeps it strong. So in our lives, the grains of sand may be the material goods and the brand names and the gold medals, while the water may aptly be the experiences, the memories that you, and the stories that you form in accomplishing those things. So I would make the case that without the water in your lives, the sand would just blow away in the wind. Number 4, build close to the ocean's edge on an incoming tide. A good castle takes time to build, during which you need ample supplies of wet sand. You may indeed be safer, as I learned, further up the beach. But if you build too far from the source of the water, you'll end up high and dry. It seems more exciting to watch it tumble back into the sea and start over, to me. To put this into life's context, don't be afraid to take the risks. Don't be afraid to make big changes in your lives, even if it's after what feels like a career decision. Sometimes a wave is exactly what you need. It takes off the pointy edges. It consolidates the sand into a nice, firm base. And when you rebuild, you can apply everything you learned the first time. And if you're like me, it's the building and not the castle that bring most meaning to your life. So I had a video queued up to show you this morning, but I decided instead to share it electronically later today. Open it if you like. What it is a boy used his phone at a beach to record a time-elapsed video of him building a dribble castle. And the camera recorded, it probably recorded for 20 or 30 minutes, and what happened was really incredible. He started by himself, and he just started putting sand down, and he started digging holes in sand. And then you watched another little boy come and watch him. And then that boy sat down, and then that boy dug his own hole, and he started adding to it. And by the end of the video, there may be a dozen boys surrounding this thing, working together, putting their hands into the soupy sand with each other, and just building this colossal drip castle. Hopefully my point is an obvious one, which is that if you enjoy what you're doing, people are going to want to do it with you. So to conclude, I would like to return to a meeting last spring when I spent a day interviewing here at Brooks. A longtime member of the Brooks community explained to me in a reflective way that Brooks was a messy place, but that he would not want it any other way. I did not understand, I got to be honest, I didn't understand what he meant. But now, having been here a year, my own interpretation of that word messy is that there is plenty of water flowing here through the sand at Brooks. We are near the edge of the ocean. Students and faculty are hard at work together building their own drip castles. And I'm very honored to be here among you with sandy hands. Thank you.